So I'm back here in Racine again. Just want to tell you guys a couple things that I've been involved with the last couple days. Yesterday was actually Dr. James Cameron's 100th birthday, the founder of America's Black Holocaust Museum, and we had a big event at City Hall to celebrate that, which was just an absolutely wonderful event. The museum actually held an event on Sunday, February 23rd, to celebrate Dr. Cameron's 100th birthday, as well as our virtual museum's second birthday, and it was very well attended. Just really a wonderful program. We had some guest speakers who came in town for that, who've actually been traveling around the country doing presentations on racial reconciliation. And they have a process that they use, which is absolutely wonderful. And I'm hoping that at some point we can get them to come back and do some more work with us, kind of help set up their program here in the state of Wisconsin. It's absolutely wonderful, the work that they do. The author, their names are Sharon Morgan and Tom DeWolf. Now Tom is from the family of the largest slave trading family in America's history. And so he and Sharon Morgan have been traveling around the country since 2009, working on this project, basically talking to people about how to build these relationships and basically have racial reconciliation. So it's really just wonderful the work that they've been doing. So it's great to have them come and be a part of that. So tonight is my first in a series of presentations on race. One of the things that I often say about race and the issues we have in this country with racism, part of why we continue to have the issues is because we don't know enough about race or racism. We don't know enough about the history of race. We don't even know where the concept of race came from. We don't know how it's defined. Everybody defines racism completely differently. So part of what I wanted to do was to ensure that we kind of get past some of that. So tonight, my first presentation in this series is what I'm calling Eugenics, a history of race betterment gone bad. And part of the reason that I wanted to start with this one was because I think that it gives us a really clear understanding of how something that seemed to be very, very well-intentioned can go badly wrong very quickly and impact literally millions and millions of people. And so we'll see that tonight. My next presentation, and these that are going to follow, I haven't scheduled yet with Jessica, but I'm going to try to come back in May to do these others. So the first one I'm going to do when I come back in May is called Race. What is it? Is it biologically constructed or socially constructed? There's always been arguments about this. Historians have argued this point, sociologists, a lot of people have argued whether or not race is biological or socially constructed. So we'll talk about that, and I think that that's going to give you a really good idea of why we see things the way we do, in terms of why we see race the way that we see it, and it'll kind of really let you know that it's something that we believe because people have told us to believe it, okay? The presentation I'm going to do after that is called Racism. And I'm going to go over the three main forms of racism: interpersonal racism, structural racism, and institutional racism. Typically, when we talk about racism, what most people typically think about are what are called interpersonal racism. We think of individual acts of racism. The first image that pops in most Americans' minds when they think of racism are things like the Ku Klux Klan or neo-Nazis, crazy people like that. But really, when you look very deeply into racism and how it manifests itself structurally and institutionally, you get a much better understanding of how powerful a force it is. I always preach this, that racism is a very powerful force. And so you guys will be able to see in great detail why it's such a powerful force during that presentation. After that, I'm going to do a history of racism in America. And this presentation is specifically designed to show you guys not only how racism has been manifested throughout American history, but the true impact that it's had on people around America throughout the time that it's been existing. Okay, and part of that, well, actually, I'll show a little bit of that tonight. You'll see some of that tonight, but that presentation will go into great detail. And I also, this is probably one of my favorites. I took a class at UWM back in the 90s. And it was called the Psychological Effects of Racism. And it was a very eye-opening class. And it really kind of looked at racism from a completely different perspective than we normally look at it from. And it looked at how it damages people psychologically. And the book, one of the books that we use for that course is actually now probably my first A or A1 books. I have a lot of, some of you guys probably heard me here several weeks ago saying this is one of my favorites, and I went on and probably listed 15 to 20 books that are my favorites. But truly probably the most impactful book that I've ever read, and it's very difficult to find because it's out of print, but it's a book called Francis Fanon and the Psychology of Oppression. And that book really kind of opened my mind to things that I had never imagined. It looked at racism from such a completely different perspective than I had ever encountered before, that it really just, it became one of my favorite books. And the main reason it became one of my favorite books was because the content was just absolutely just mind-blowing. The second reason it became one of my favorite books was because the bibliography in the back of the book had so many wonderful resources in terms of other books, papers that had been written, so much stuff. I mean, I can tell you that I probably purchased, and this is no exaggeration, just out of the bibliography of that book, I could say that I probably purchased 50 books as a result of reading that one book. My wife isn't happy because the books are all over the house, but that book is just, I'm telling you, it is just unbelievable. Yes, ma'am.
What was that title?
Francis Fanon. Francis Fanon, F-R-A-N-T-Z. Fanon is F-A-N-O-N. Francis Fanon and the Psychology of Oppression. It's written by a guy by the name of Hussein Bulhan, or Hussein Bulhan. Just to give you a little background, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Francis Fanon at all.
No.
Francis Fanon was born on the island of Martinique in the Caribbean, and he grew up in a very segregated society. It was a colonial possession of France at the time when he was a child. He was very bright, very articulate. He went to college in France, became a psychiatrist. And his first job as a psychiatrist was actually in Algeria, which was another colonial possession of France. And while he was working as a psychiatrist in this hospital, treating people who had very severe mental disorders, he said that one of the things he discovered very quickly, because at that particular time, the Algerian people were fighting back against the French, trying to kick the French out of their country, trying to gain their independence. And the French were very brutal in terms of repressing that revolt. And so there was this long, bloody war where nearly 1 million or somewhere around 1 million Algerians lost their lives, and maybe a couple hundred French lost their lives. But the French government was very brutal, but they ended up losing. The Algerians ended up winning. But what Francis Fanon found as a psychiatrist in this hospital, he found that he had patients who had been tortured by the government. And he would have other patients who were actually doing the torturing. So these people who had been tortured were tortured souls in the mind, and they were coming to him to get relief. And then the people who were torturing these people, they were tortured in the mind as well. And he said that it was just amazing, this ability of people who tortured to actually release that information and show that even though they did this and it was part of their job, that they were willing to admit to him that they were doing these horrible things. And so Francis Fanon became this giant in trying to find a way for people to deal with the psychological effects of racism. And he wrote a series of books. Dying Colonialism is one of the books he wrote. He also wrote The Wretched of the Earth, which is probably his most well-known book. Another one he wrote was Black Skin, White Mask. And he talks about his life. He talks about his life as a psychiatrist in Algeria, and it's just a fascinating story. So the book that I'm talking about initially, Francis Fanon and the Psychology of Oppression, does a very good job of detailing Francis Fanon's life and his philosophies and how he came about those philosophies and the work that he did and the impact that he had on so many other people. So I'm going to talk in great detail when I come back to that presentation. about the things that are in that book about Franz Fanon, and it's just a fascinating story. So I'm hoping that you guys are able to make it to all of those, if not as many as possible, because I think that the way that I put this together, I want at the end of this process, I want us to have enough of a foundation that we can actually start to work on racism. And like I've said before, you can't work on a problem if you don't understand the problem in great detail. We have conversations about race in America all the time, but in most cases, in my opinion, they're useless conversations. Nothing real actually comes out of those conversations in most cases. And primarily the reason why is because we go into those conversations as ignorant people. Not to say that's a bad thing, but ignorant in terms we don't have enough information to really clearly understand what the problem is. It would be the same as if you went into the hospital and they did surgery on your brain, but they didn't do some scans on your brain first. They didn't do some analysis to determine exactly what the problem is before they cut your head open and started looking around and poking around in it. Nobody in this room, I'm sure, would want that to happen, right? You call these people idiots or quacks or whatever if they cut open your head without doing a thorough analysis first. So this series on race is what I propose as my method of doing all of the things that are going to take you guys that are here for these to that place that you're going to become at the end, where you have all of the necessary information you need to battle racism in an effective way.
Do you want to know what it is? The Matrix is everywhere. It is all around us. Even now, in this very room. You can see it when you look out your window or when you turn on your television. You can feel it when you go to work, when you go to church, when you pay your taxes. It is the world that has been pulled over your eyes to blind you from the truth. What truth? That you are a slave, Neo. Like everyone else, you were born into bondage, born into a prison that you cannot smell or taste or touch. A prison for your mind. Unfortunately, no one can be told what the Matrix is. You have to see it for yourself. This is your last chance. After this, there is no turning back. You take the blue pill, the story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. Remember, all I'm offering is the truth, nothing more.
I love this movie. And this is my favorite scene in the movie. Because to me, this movie, especially that particular scene, is directly related to what I'm talking about in terms of racism. We live in a world where we've had the wool pull over our eyes, and the world really isn't what we think it is. And part of the reason that it isn't what we think it is because people have designed the way we learn, the way we're educated, to see the world in a particular way. Just as in the Matrix, they had the opportunity to escape that fake world. I'm offering you guys the opportunity tonight to escape that fake world. So I'm asking you tonight, do you want to take the red pill or the blue pill? If you choose to take the blue pill, you may as well get up and go home right now. If you take the other pill, we're going to go down that wormhole, and it's going to be the adventure of your life. So who tonight wants to take the red pill? Raise your hand, please.
We're here.
Okay. Anyone want to take the blue pill? How many people are kind of undecided? Well, I can tell you, just by you being here tonight, you've already bitten that red pill. Because I'm going to put it in your mouth whether you like it or not. Let's move on. Eugenics was a pseudoscience that was created in the late 1800s, and it was created by some of the giants in the science of the West. Created by men in England, these ideas were spread to the United States, to other parts of Europe, and eventually one nation that really gravitated towards these ideas and took them to a whole nother place was the nation of Germany. And we all are aware of what happened during the Holocaust in Germany. So that was the end result of something that started in the mind of one man. We'll talk about who that individual was. And I love this song. It's Beethoven. And part of the reason I thought that it would fit was because, anybody know where Beethoven is from? Germany. Germany. So, this old question, which came first, the chicken or the egg? People have been asking that question forever. Which came first, the chicken or the egg? But I want you guys to look at it from a different perspective. This was a poster that was found in Nazi Germany in the 1930s. And what it says is race pollution. Since 1923, Julius Streicher has enlightened the public about race pollution. In 1933, the Führer declared race pollution a crime punishable by imprisonment. Nevertheless, thousands of race crimes continue to be committed in Germany by Jews. What is race pollution? Why did the Führer proclaim the Nuremberg laws? Why do Jews systematically and in massive numbers commit racial crimes against the German woman? What are the consequences of race pollution for the German maiden? What are the consequences of race pollution for the German Volk? And Volk means people. New Sturmer special issue. So this was all over Germany in the 1930s. In the 1930s. 1913. 29 states had laws forbidding mixed race marriages, not in Germany, but in the United States of America. 22 states had stiff penalties for miscegenation, which is marriage across race, fines of up to $2,000, and or prison terms up to 10 years. So, which came first, the chicken or the egg? 1913 or 1933? Which came first? We always, as Americans, we're always blasting the Nazis and talking about how horrible they were and all of these horrible things they did. And these policies were just crazy and racist and just unbelievable. We did it first. We did it first. A lot of the ideas that the Nazis used, a lot of the policies they developed as a direct result of things that were going on in the United States that we're going to talk about tonight.
But the Europeans.
What about the Europeans?
Yeah, that's who was here in the United States, the Europeans.
We're going to talk about that. Because not every European is the same.
Okay.
So we're going to talk about the founding of eugenics. We're going to talk about its progression from Darwin, Mendel, to a man by the name of Galton. These are some important questions we're going to answer tonight about eugenics. What is it? Where did it come from? Who practiced it? How did it manifest itself? What happened to it? And why is it still important? Okay. All of those questions will be answered during our presentation tonight. But before I get started, I want to just see by a show of hands, how many of you guys have ever heard of eugenics before? Okay. On a scale of 1 to 10, how many of you guys would say that your knowledge of eugenics is between 1 and 5? How many of you guys would say your knowledge of eugenics is above 5? Okay. Okay. So, some of you are pretty well versed in it. Some of you are probably novices. Learned a little bit about it. There's been a lot written about it, particularly within the last 20 or so years. Prior to that, I did a search, and I found that there were very few books, very few journal articles written about eugenics prior to about 20 years ago. And so there's a very specific reason for that, which I'll talk about later. So let's move on. Eugenics comes from the Greek language, EU, which means well, and gen, which means born. So eugenics means basically well-born. Charles Darwin, we've all heard of Darwin, right? 1859, he wrote his most famous book on the origins of species. And he basically told the world about his theory of, anybody know? What we call evolution. He called it natural selection, okay? And so he believed that artificial selection involves selective breeding. And that word breeding will come up over and over and over tonight. You guys are going to hear a lot about breeding. So, he died in 1882. He wrote this book in 1859. But he wrote another book, which is much less well known, in 1871, called The Descent of Man. And this is a quote from The Descent of Man. He says these things, and I'll read it to you. With savages, the weak in body or mind are soon eliminated, and those that survive commonly exhibit a vigorous state of health. We civilized men, on the other hand, do our utmost to check the process of elimination. We build asylums for the imbecile, the maimed, and the sick. We institute poor laws, and our medical men exert their utmost skill to save the life of everyone to the last moment. Thus, the weak members of civilized societies propagate their kind. No one who has attended to the breeding of domestic animals will doubt that this must be highly injurious to the race of man. It is surprising how soon a want of care, or care wrongly directed, leads to the degeneration of a domestic race. But, excepting in the case of man himself, hardly anyone is so ignorant as to allow his worst animals to breed. Very interesting. Very interesting. And like I said, the word breed comes up over and over again. It amazed me when I was researching this. The entire history of eugenics and all of the books I read and articles and whatnot. No one mentioned this, with the exception of one particular source. No one mentioned this. I had actually seen it before because I had done a presentation many years ago on race and how race is seen. And it amazes me how this particular book is ignored by most people, because what most people do when they talk about Darwin himself, they tend to distance him from the eugenics movement. They say that he really had nothing to do with it, but really, when you look into the words that he said, it was very closely associated with the words of the people that came after him. So some of the influential figures. How many of you guys have heard of Herbert Spencer? Herbert Spencer, he coined the term survival of the fittest in a book that he wrote. Herbert Spencer is typically considered to be the father of what's called social Darwinism. So Darwinism on a people level, on a social level. Gregor Mendel, you guys have probably seen this in science class somewhere along the way, his studies of peas. And he really was a brilliant guy, and he wrote this brilliant research, and everybody pretty much said, oh, it was okay. And they ignored it for the next 35 years. So he wrote this wonderful book about his research, and he discovered the science of heritability. And he says that, you know, we can basically take these different crops and we can breed them in a particular way, and we know what the outcome will be based on how we breed these peas. And he took tens of thousands of different peas and did this with it. So his research was just absolutely astonishing, but it was ignored for about 35 years. In 1900, someone found his research again, and it became part of the lexicon of the eugenics movement. Karl Pearson was a student of Francis Gault, who we'll talk about, and he helped bring the ideas of eugenics across the Atlantic. He was a big proponent of eugenics. Charles Davenport, one of the first Americans to embrace Mendelian genetics, founder and first director of the International Federation of Eugenics Organizations in 1925. So these are some people that were very influential, and we'll talk about some of them in detail. that actually helped this movement, this science as it was known at that time, become something that was very, very popular, especially among the well-to-do. This young man, well, he was young at one time, he looks pretty old there, Sir Francis Gault. This man was a student in London, and he was studying biology, but he really didn't like it. So he switched. He started to study math. He's also a half cousin of Charles Darwin, by the way. He studied math at Cambridge, and he found that he was really, really interested in looking deeply into things. He was a tinkerer. He wanted to be able to look at things in great detail in ways that other people had never really done. One of the things that he did, he said, man, let me ask these people around England to send me their reports of weather conditions over the last 20 years. And so what he was able to do, he looked at that information, he found patterns in the weather. And he developed the first ever weather maps on the planet Earth. So you see, the guy was pretty smart, right? In addition to that, he discovered that the raised edges on our fingertips have a specific pattern that's different in everybody. So he is a guy who came up with the concept of fingerprinting, and he passed it on to authorities, and they began the art of fingerprinting criminals. Very brilliant guy, right? Wouldn't you say? Pretty interesting guy, pretty smart guy. But what he's most known for is that he's the founder of eugenics. The founder of eugenics, Sir Francis Gault. So let's look at the beginnings. He wrote this book, Hereditary Genius, an inquiry into the laws and consequences. And this is what he wrote in 1869. He used data from a variety of different sources, and he looked at all of these different people, and he looked at their family histories. He asked these people to send them information if they could, but for the most part he couldn't get it. But he was able to find sources and get information on the family histories of all of these well-to-do people. And he was able to draw conclusions. He basically said that superior intelligence and abilities were inherited with an efficiency of about 20% among primary relatives in these families of the people that he looked up.
What does that mean? Efficiency of 20%?
Well, what he basically said was that you could pretty much guarantee that if a person was intelligent, and if you looked at their progeny moving forward, about 20% of those people would be intelligent as well. So he said that it's not a guarantee, but it's a pretty strong possibility that if you look back in the histories of people, you'll find that intelligent people had intelligent parents, grandparents, so on and so forth. So let's look at who we looked at though. This is the important part. I want you guys to read this excerpt first, and then we're going to look at who we looked at. So this is him telling you how he started this process of looking at heredity and how it works in people. So at the end, I want to skip to the end where it says, I made a cursory examination into the kindred of about 400 illustrious men of all periods of history, and the results were such, in my own opinion, as completely to establish the theory that genius was hereditary. So if there's a genius in your family, there was probably a genius in your family sometime in the past. This is what he believed from the research that he did on these 400 illustrious men. And I want you guys to pay attention. Anytime you see something in yellow in the presentation, I want you guys to pay attention to it particularly. And I'll explain why. So who did he study? Did he go out and find just random average people to look at? Of course not. He's looking for genius. He doesn't think he's going to find genius in some guy that's sitting on the sidewalk begging for money. He doesn't think he's going to find genius in some factory where these children are working. So he looked at the best and the brightest. The judges of England between 1660 and 1863. Statesmen, commanders, literary men, men of science, poets, musicians, painters, divines, senior classics of Cambridge, oarsmen, wrestlers of the North Country. All of these very well-to-do people. And if you really think about it, if you look at people that are in these positions, they're probably going to be pretty well-off people, right? And typically, well-off people that end up in these particular positions are thought of differently than other people in society. So let's look at how he defined eugenics. He wrote this book in 1883, and he defined eugenics. He came up with the word eugenics to describe this new field that he had created. All influences that tend in however remote a degree to give to the more suitable races or strains of blood a better chance of prevailing speedily over the less suitable than they otherwise would have had. So he believed that if you looked at it from a scientific perspective, you could actually project into the future how well different people would end up in life. And he believed that you could do it very accurately using statistics. Okay? So if you notice, there's some more yellow writing there. More suitable races, less suitable. One of the things that I found very interesting about all of these people who were part of the eugenics movement and the conversations they had and the things that they talked about, they used very, very descriptive language to describe individuals. They used these descriptors to basically let you know how they felt about these particular people. More suitable races. More suitable to whom? Less suitable. Less suitable to whom? That's the question. The purpose of eugenics. He reasoned that talent and quality were more than an accident. They could be calculated, managed, and sharpened into a highly gifted race of men by judicious marriages during several consecutive generations. This is what became known as positive eugenics. Does that sound familiar to you guys? This highly gifted race of men? Does that bring up something historically from Germany in 1930s? Does it sound a little familiar? Okay. And he wrote this in 1883. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? All right. He also believed that it would be something that would help to improve human society by selective breeding. So he concluded, when eugenically preferred persons mated with one another, their offspring were more valuable. But mixing eugenically well-endowed humans with inferior mates would not strengthen succeeding generations. Rather, it would promote a downward biological spiral. What was worse, two people of bad blood would only create progressively more defective offspring. The descriptive language again. Eugenically preferred persons. Preferred by whom? More valuable. More valuable to whom? Well-endowed humans. According to whose definitions? Inferior mates. According to whose definition? Defective offspring. Defective according to whom? You see the descriptive language that's used over and over and over again. But he had doubts. He had doubts. He knew that looking at it statistically, that it was, you know, pretty good assurance that these things would happen, but it was not 100% sure. So he and his followers actually admitted that eugenic principles were just probabilities and not scientifically provable. He also proposed, instead of having the government use eugenics, he said this is what we can do instead. Let's come up with a national religion. A national religion. He said that was the only way eugenics could thrive. Eugenical marriage should be strictly enforced as a religious duty. Marrying well should be your religious duty. He felt that that would be much more effective than some scientists telling you, you should marry well. So that's what he proposed. Well, people in America didn't listen to his doubts. They listened to him and they said, hey, this guy's right about everything except his doubts. His doubts, forget his doubts. Everything else he said is, we love it. Eugenics traveled to America, and it was the intersection of racism and ethnocentrism that drove eugenics in America. Americans suggested eugenic cleansing. Imagine this. We've heard of racial cleansing in Kosovo. We've heard of racial cleansing in Germany, obviously. Although no scientific proof was attained by Galton or any of his followers, American eugenicists had already convinced themselves, regardless of his doubts, that those of different races and ethnic backgrounds considered inferior were no more than a hereditary blight in need of eugenic cleansing. Once again, descriptive language is inferior, hereditary blight. These things all sound very familiar. They sound like the same things that the Nazis said. And they said them for a particular reason. There was this idea that there was a supremacy within Europeans. Someone mentioned earlier, there were Europeans in America. Well, not every European was considered to be the same type of European. People of this ilk, the eugenicists of the world, and very nativist-minded Americans who believed that the best and brightest of America came from Northern and Western Europe. They believed that people from other parts of Europe weren't as good. And so when we think of the concept of race in this context, it's different than the concept of race we have nowadays. What they consider to be racist is more what we would now consider to be an ethnicity. So they considered the German people to be a race of people, the French people to be a race of people, Norwegians to be a race of people. That's kind of how they looked at it in the context they used at that particular time. So when they were talking about race back then, in most cases, that's what they were talking about. Madison Grant wrote this absolutely just incredible book, super duper popular, sold untold millions of copies, and still is selling well. I actually looked it up on Amazon.com and Barnes & Noble. People are still buying this crazy book. It was called The Passing of the Great Race, and he stated that Nordics were the white man par excellence, the best and the brightest of white men. These early American eugenicists believed that Germans and Nordic comprised the supreme race. The supreme race. So basically they're saying that this particular group, these people, the Nordics and the Germans, were better than other white people. We've kind of lumped all the white people in together in America recently, but at this time, I'm sorry. Some of you would have been allowed into the family of whites, some of you, you're outside. You're not included. Sorry. You may look like us, but you're not in the family. That's the way they looked at people. Another man, Lothrop Stoddard, wrote that Nordic populations were decreasing in this another crazy book, The Rising Tide of Color Against White World Supremacy. He said the Industrial Revolution had attracted squalid Mediterranean peoples who quickly outnumbered the more desirable Nordics. Once again, descriptive language. White man par excellence, supreme race, squalid Mediterranean peoples, desirable Nordics. Very descriptive language. American eugenics basically became race science in this country. This eugenics was reborn, recast, and redirected in the United States as a purely and uniquely American quest. It became something completely different than Gault had ever imagined it to be. It was used in a completely different way than Gault had ever imagined it would be. And the Americans set the stage for how other people used it later. Race mixing was considered race suicide. Madison Grant warned us. He said, the cross between a white man and an Indian is an Indian. The cross between a white man and a Negro is a Negro. The cross between a white man and a Hindu is a Hindu. And the cross between any of the three European races and a Jew is a Jew. So they considered race mixing to be suicidal. If you mixed these Nordic, wonderful Nordic people, with someone of a lesser race from Europe, they were going to automatically mess up the gene pool. Okay? That's how they saw it. So let's follow the money. I always believe that when you do research, you gotta follow the money. 1901, you guys have heard of Andrew Carnegie, steel magnate. He sold his company for $400 million and retired to a life of philanthropy. He decided, I'm gonna just start giving my money away. I have so much of it, I don't need all of it. I'm just gonna start giving it away. So one of the groups that he gave it to, he gave money to help start this Carnegie Institution of Washington. And it was a joint venture with The U.S. Congress, they put in some of the money, he put in some of the money. So this is government-sanctioned institution. The Carnegie Institution was established to be one of the premier scientific organizations of the world, dedicated by charter, and these are the words directly from their charter, to encourage in the broadest and most liberal manner investigation, research, and discovery, and the application of knowledge to the improvement of mankind. That sounds pretty good, right? I mean, that's a worthy cause. It sounds, well, that's very, I mean, I think everybody would say, let's do it. That's a great idea, let's do it. And a lot of people said, let's do it. And guess what? They started to do it. They started to do it. 24 of America's most respected names in science, government, and finance were installed as trustees of this Carnegie Institution of Washington. So, they use the money for something that you would never imagine. They would study, among other things, negative eugenics. The program would quickly become known as the practical means for cutting off defective germplasm and would embrace a gamut of remedies from segregation to sterilization to euthanasia. This radical human engineering program would spring not from medical schools and health clinics of America, but from the pastures, barns, and chicken coops, because the advocates of eugenics were primarily plant and animal breeders. Essentially, they believed humans could be spawned and spayed like trout and horses. So, once again, you see descriptive language, defective germplasm. At this particular time, germplasm is what we nowadays call DNA. So these people who really believed in this were people who bred animals. And they knew that they could bred specific types of animals and make specific types of money by breeding animals in a proper way. So they said, if we can do it with animals, we should be able to do the same thing with humans, right? And Carnegie gave them money to do that. Mr. Charles Davenport, this young man, looks kind of old in the picture, but as a young man, he secured a doctorate in biology from Harvard and soon became a zoology instructor at Harvard. Later, he held a similar position at the University of Chicago. He was very much interested in eugenics. He was very entranced by Galton. He wrote letters to Galton's family, wanting to get more information about Galton's views. He became one of the primary authors of America's eugenical policies. This was his plan. There's a place called Cold Spring Harbor, Long Island, New York, where this laboratory was set up. And the aims of this establishment would be the analytical and experimental study of race change. And remember, race at this particular time, the concept of race was more like ethnicities, because most Europeans were not considered to be of one race. The Germanic people, the French people, the Norwegians, so on and so forth. So, this is a picture of the office, Eugenics Record Office. 1910, Davenport obtained funds from Mrs. E.H. Harriman to found the Eugenics Record Office. Now, the Harriman family made tremendous amounts of money in the railroad business, so they were very wealthy. They set up this office to basically now begin to conduct family studies, publishing how-to books, journals, training caseworkers, and amassing hundreds of thousands of pedigrees and articles. And one of the things that came out of this was that people began to say, wow, this is really good, valuable information. We can use this. And you know, it used to be very, very common, not so much nowadays, for people to go to state fairs to actually learn things. Now we go to state fair to eat or to ride rides. People used to go to state fairs to learn about stuff. And they used to have people from the Eugenics Record Office that traveled to these state fairs around the country, giving information, training people on their theories and whatnot, and they began to set up booths where you could bring in your children, and they would have what they call Better Baby Contest. And so you could come in and you could put your child into this Better Baby Contest, and you had these judges that looked at, you know, the family history and all of these other things, and then they adjudicated which baby was the better baby. And all of these things came out of the Eugenics Record Office and became extremely popular. I mean, people from around the country were just rushing to state fairs to put their babies into these contests. And also fitter family contests. Watch this.
At the turn of the 20th century, rapid industrialization and urbanization led to a social upheaval, defined by goals for a civilization free of violence, disease, and mental ailments. However, the means by which this utopian society would be attempted would include some of the most profound ethical violations in the history of the United States.
The president was behind it, liberals were behind it, conservatives were behind it, even the Catholic Church at one point was behind it.
Intense growth of American industry, agricultural mechanization, and widespread immigration led to the first major migration away from the farms and into the city, which is now expanding faster than adequate housing could be provided. The solution to the modern problems of an industrialized society required increased government involvement in the social sphere, a philosophy known as progressivism. The construct of scientific management offered a methodical means of social engineering. Geneticists of the age could prove, through the use of human pedigrees and their knowledge of plant and animal genetics, that degeneracy was an inheritable trait. It seemed only right that if a society free of all mental and physical ailments, free of violence and crime, illiteracy and foolishness, it seemed only right to end the reproductive capabilities of people expressing these traits. Eugenics was the result of an America unwilling to make social changes, an upper class fearful of its laboring counterparts. Eugenics placed the blame of a social quandary on individual races and classes, and thus freed from culpability the industrial, scientific, and political barons of the time. Cold Spring Harbor, New York, 1910. Charles B. Davenport, along with Harry H. Laughlin, both biologists and members of the American Breeders' Association, found the Eugenics Record Office with financial help from the Carnegie Institution. The ERO would be the headquarters of eugenic research in the United States for the next 34 years. Using various research methods, including human pedigrees, hereditary questionnaires, interviewing groups of special interest such as circus performers, and collecting census data, the ERO was able to justify the administration of eugenic laws nationwide, including immigration and marriage restrictions, race segregation, and forced sterilization of criminals and other undesirables. The ERO, however, was not only able to justify the eugenics atrocities, but integrated them into popular culture to make eugenics and related terms, such as race hygiene, household words. Popular literature published in the 20s often donned eugenics in their subject matter, such as these manuals on raising a healthy family. Clergymen preached of the necessity for good marriages. Perhaps even more disturbing were the contests held at many state fairs, where awards were given to the fittest family, those with the purest pedigrees, and undoubtedly the most attractive phenotypes would receive awards, such as this medal with an inscription reading, "Yea, I have a goodly heritage."
The eugenics movement spawned lots of people who were considered, even in their own time, out on the fringe, who even endorsed such things as euthanasia. But that was not a mainline part of the movement. It certainly became parts of the movement internationally, but not so much here in America.
On March 9, 1907, the Indiana State Senate, in a vote of 28 to 16, made history by being the first jurisdiction in the world to force the sterilization of citizens it deemed unfit. Unfit to exist, unfit to reproduce. Connecticut was soon to follow. By the time Laughlin of the ERO had published his suggestion on how to implement legislation for forced human sterilization, 12 states had already put into place sterilization laws of their own. By 1924, 3,000 socially inadequate people had been sterilized. That same year, based on Laughlin's model, Aubrey E. Strode drafted Virginia's Eugenical Sterilization Act in an attempt to rid the state of defective persons. It passed in Virginia's General Assembly via landslide. Immediately, the Virginia Colony for the Epileptic and Feeble-Minded selected 17-year-old Carrie Buck to be the first human sterilized under the act. Carrie had a feeble-minded child, the result of a raping by one of her relatives, and was daughter of a feeble-minded mother, Emma, already a resident on the Virginia colony. Carrie, purportedly carrying the genetic traits of feeble-mindedness and sexual promiscuity, was a fine candidate, as the law stated those to be sterilized must be probable potential parents of socially inadequate offspring. Carrie's feeble-mindedness was based on a male disposition by Laughlin, who had never met Carrie, and her sexual promiscuity was based on the testimony of her schoolteacher that she sent flirtatious notes to schoolboys. Carey became the first person in Virginia to be sterilized under the new law on October 19, 1927. In the words of Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, official deliverer of the opinion of the United States Supreme Court in the case of Buck v. Bell, "It is better for all of the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime, or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough." Vivian, Carey's feeble-minded daughter, received B's on her first grade report card. Buck v. Bell justified the sterilizations of over 8,000 Virginians. Over the history of the United States, 33 states have enacted statutes under which 60,000 Americans underwent compulsory sterilizations. To this day, Buck v. Bell has never been overruled.
Nazi Germany embraced the eugenics movement from the United States and just upped it in its efficiency.
It should now be apparent that Germany's racial theories did not take place in a vacuum, nor can the fundamental philosophies and beliefs that would eventually lead to the atrocities of the Nazi state be attributed solely to German authorities. In fact, German scientists expressed a great affinity towards U.S. eugenic laws. A young Adolf Hitler wrote positively of the U.S.'s immigration restrictions, more specifically how the law refuses immigration on principle by simply excluding certain races for naturalization, in his book Mein Kampf. Shortly prior to mobilizing the most comprehensive eugenics legislation in modern history, Gerhard Wagner, head of the National Socialist Physician League, stated that America's eugenic policies should be used as a model for Germany to follow. Marie Kopp of the American Committee on Maternal Health proclaimed that the Nazi system of seeking out those to be sterilized was administered in entire fairness and was formulated after careful study of the California experiment, which had been responsible for 2,500 of the 3,000 involuntary sterilizations in the U.S. prior to 1924. The ERO boasted on how the German statute on race hygiene read almost identical to Laughlin's model sterilization law. Laughlin had such a significant impact on Nazi racial legislature that he was awarded an honorary degree from the University of Heidelberg. Laughlin thanked the university for reaffirming the common understanding of German and American scientists of the nature of eugenics. This common understanding would be translated into the law on preventing hereditarily ill progeny, which would be responsible for over 375,000 sterilizations in the Nazi state. A number so impressive, one American eugenics advocate complained, "The Germans are beating us at our own game." The sterilization program of the Nazi state, modeled after Laughlin's law and other U.S. eugenic theories, would be a gross prelude to the exterminations of the Holocaust. But even before the gas chambers were opened for the racist and anti-Semitic persecutions we know all too well, they were opened in October 1939 for the systematic murder of the mentally ill citizens of Germany. Sadly, this practice was not faced with nearly as much stigmatism within the states, as euthanasia had long been discussed by American eugenicists as a solution for the feeble-minded.
So when people saw how eugenics can easily be abused by the power of the state, they said, that's it. This is a monstrous idea that we should keep a distance from.
It is now the dawn of the 21st century, and advancements in technology and medicine have excelled beyond even the most ambitious of projections. Science that eugenicists of the 20th century could only have dreamed of appear in our news every single day.
Of stem cell research.
Handpicking the genes of our children.
Cloning of embryos for their destruction.
They discovered stem cells in a new place.
Genetic test. Is it a danger? It's always a danger when there are technologies that can be used and abused. And I think that the history of the eugenics movement tells us when a technology actually exists, people will try to use it, sometimes for reasons it was never intended to be.
This was the logo of the Eugenics Record Office, and they basically told everyone that this was, true science, that its foundations came from medicine, surgery, psychiatry, sociology, genealogy, biography, statistics, anthropology, so on and so forth. So they really looked at it as something that was very, very scientifically compatible, and they knew that very few people would question the science, because not a lot of people had enough information about how all of these things work together to really challenge it. And most of the proponents of it, including people like President Woodrow Wilson, Alexander Graham Bell, just to name a couple, really believed that this was something that was very good for America. They believed that the positive eugenics, which was having well-born people marry and have children by other well-born people, was a good policy. And they also believed just as strongly in the negative eugenics that unfit people should not be allowed to have children. And so they put policies in place to make sure those things would not happen. Harry Laughlin, who you just saw in the video, wrote a model sterilization law that the state of Virginia enacted into law. And this law was copied nearly word for word by the Nazis. And they gave him an honorary doctorate at Heidelberg University in Germany as a result of the great work that he had done for eugenics. He was the director of the Eugenics Record Office from the time it opened in 1910 until it closed in 1939. He was awarded this honorary degree for his work on behalf of the science of racial cleansing by Heidelberg University. One of his key interests was to aid in the proliferation of compulsory sterilization legislation in the U.S. He wrote a model sterilization law in 1949. This was one of the key components of eugenics, was to sterilize the unfit. Supported the passage of Virginia's Racial Integrity Act, which outlawed miscegenation or race mixing. So this guy was one of the giants of eugenics as it played out in America. He was powerful enough that he could get legislation passed in Virginia, which would be copied years later by the Nazis. He pushed positive eugenics as well as negative eugenics. So let's look at the work of eugenicists. This is one of the tools that eugenicists use. This was a device that they used to measure people's heads. They measured people's heads, and they said, based on the size of people's heads, we can determine the size of their brains. And obviously, it's nonsense, but they said that based on the size of someone's brain, we can tell how intelligent they are or are not. Of course, all of this work that was done measuring brains proved years later to be a bunch of nonsense, but at the time it was believed to be absolutely, positively, scientifically accurate. July 15, 1911, Laughlin and the Maine American Breeders Association committee members met at prestigious City Club on Manhattan Island. During a number of subsequent conferences that they held, they carefully debated this, the problem of cutting off the supply of defectives, and systematically plotted a bold campaign of purging the blood of the American people of the handicapping and deteriorating influences of these antisocial classes. 10 groups were eventually identified as socially unfit and targeted for elimination by this group of people. So imagine this. Here we are in America, land of the free, home of the brave. And these people are talking about eliminating 10 groups of people from American society. This isn't Adolf Hitler, Joseph Mengele. These are people in America. 1911. Hitler wasn't, I don't even know what Hitler was doing in 1911, but he definitely wasn't anybody special in terms of having power in 1911. These people were talking about doing these things in America, eliminating people that they considered to be unfit. And like I said earlier, unfit according to whom's definition? Who has the audacity to decide that certain people are unfit? Who has the power? They gave it to themselves. These are the people they said were unfit. Feeble-minded people, pauper class, inebriate or alcoholics, criminals, epileptics, the insane, the constitutionally weak, the deformed, deaf, blind, and mute. All of these people were unfit to continue living, and they were also unfit to have children. We needed to eliminate them from American society to improve our chances moving forward. Imagine if somebody was crazy enough to preach this policy today. They would be, I don't know what would happen to them, but people would not say very nice things about them, right? These people pushed these policies, and they had the support of governments around the country. They had the support of universities around the country. They had the support of presidents, congressmen. These were not just some fly-by-night guys. They had powerful people pushing these agendas. Their committee targeted their extended families as well. So it's not just saying that we should get rid of these people, but listen, if they have a brother or sister or mother that's still around, we got to get rid of them too, because there's always a possibility they can have more unfit children. We got to get rid of their families too. So not just them, but their families. They said even if those relatives seem perfectly normal and were not institutionalized, they considered them equally unfit because they carried the defective germ plasm that might crop up in a future generation. Imagine the audacity of these individuals to determine who could and could not live, literally live, in this country. They didn't want to push the people out of the country and send them somewhere else. They wanted to make sure these people no longer existed. This was the policy of eugenics. This is what they proposed. They wanted to sterilize as many people as they could get their hands on. There was a study done of this family known as the Kallikaks. I'm not going to go into great detail about them, but you guys should look up the Kallikaks. K-A-L-L-I-K-A-C-K. This is a family that was studied, supposedly, scientifically, and it was shown that way back during the Revolutionary War days, that this family had defective people in it. And these defective people from way back during the Revolutionary War days continued to have defective children generation after generation after generation, and as a result, in the early or the late 1800s, practically everybody in the family was unfit. And they traced it by going back and said, see, this is what happens when you allow unfit people to have children. They never stop. So they decided to push for sterilization.
Dr. McIntosh says for you to make a thorough examination of the girl. We won't need you in the operating room for this lad.
Oh, Dr. Brooks, must I go through with this? Can't you get him to wait till tomorrow?
I'm afraid not.
But they'd do it for you if you asked them.
But the staff have their orders.
If you could only get him to wait just one day. Jim says he knows somebody who might be able to help us.
No one here has the authority to postpone it.
Who gave them the authority to tell me that I can't bring life into the world? Only God has that right. Oh, Dr. Brooks, you told me that you had a little girl in your home. You must know how I feel.
Yes, I do.
Then won't you please try to do something? I just know you can. A man like you. You're the only one who could help me now. You've got to. Good God, there must be a way. Please, God, show him, won't you? Show him how. Please, please.
What's on your mind? Well, it's about that girl upstairs. We can't let this thing happen to her.
Nathan girl? I'm afraid it's too late to do anything about that now. We operate on her next.
Not if I can stop it.
Listen, Brooks, I like you. You're one of the most promising young doctors we've ever had on the staff. I don't want you to let me down. The law must be obeyed. There's nothing we can do about that now.
Oh, but there must be. Dr. McIntosh, can't you refuse to perform this operation?
Refuse? I? You must be joking.
Oh, no, I was never more serious in my life.
I can't do a thing like that.
Oh, but your word would carry a lot of weight, sir.
Why are you so certain this girl shouldn't be sterilized?
I tell you, Doctor, that she is normal, perfectly so. It would be criminal to perform this operation.
You're exaggerating.
Oh, I'd stake my life on it. Why, do you realize, Doctor, that she's been working since she was a mere child, carrying the burdens of her entire family? Why, there must be good stuff in her. And you couldn't find a finer specimen than the boy she wants to marry.
You're mixing sentiment with your science, Brooks.
Why not? Is science always right? Well, you're proceeding on a trial and error basis. Is that fair? But what about the medical commission and the courts? Why, they don't investigate thoroughly. They treat people like so many cattle. And as usual, it's the poor who suffer. Why, take that girl.
Her papers were in order. She had a court hearing like everyone else. And I'm convinced that in her case, the order was justified.
Dr. McIntosh, you've been my ideal ever since I came to this hospital. I thought that you considered human values as well as scientific ones.
I do consider that. Not for the sake of the individual, but for the good of the public at large. You've seen this girl's family. That's the most eloquent argument I can think of.
Oh, but why wreck her life because of them?
We're getting nowhere, Brooks. I see no reason in continuing this discussion.
Then you won't help me get a delay so at least this girl's case can be reviewed?
No, Brooks, I will not. About time we're getting back to the floor now.
I won't have anything to do with that operation.
Don't be a fool, Brooks.
I don't want the memory of that girl haunting me for the rest of my life. I don't want to know she may be in a gutter somewhere and I helped to put her there.
I can't waste any more time. Return to your work immediately, or else leave your resignation here on my desk.
Shall I have the nurse call Brooks, Doctor?
No, you'll assist me in this. I've just had a serious talk with Brooks. We'll let him work this thing out by himself.
He's too worried about this case, but I can see his side of it. Alice, I've done everything I can. I refuse to have anything to do with it myself. It may mean that I must resign. But I can't stop it. And believe me, I'm sorry.
I know. You've been awfully good to me. I'll never forget that.
Well, we're going to get you ready now. Bet you didn't know I was a barber. Well, how are you feeling? She's a little nervous, I guess. Oh, that's natural enough. I feel a little nervous myself.
So, the way these forced sterilizations worked around the United States was that they had panels that were put together, scientists, doctors, that would go to the courts and issue a decree saying this person was unfit and they should be sterilized. So they carried a legal document into these hospitals and they decreed that by the order of the government, we can sterilize you. And there was absolutely nothing that you could do about it. Forced sterilization laws. 1907, Indiana became the first jurisdiction on the planet Earth to pass a sterilization law. The first ever. 1909, California, Connecticut, and Washington State followed suit. 1911, Nevada, Iowa, New Jersey followed suit. 1912, New York followed suit. By 1914, 12 states had passed mandatory sterilization laws. Imagine that. 12 states by 1914. Wisconsin became the 12th state to pass one in 1915. Yes?
Reggie, how old were the women when they went?
They were a variety of different ages, mostly young. The majority of people who were sterilized would be young people. They wanted to get to them before they had children. Many times they would sterilize young children. I believe I read of one 9-year-old girl who was sterilized in California. So they started at an early age for many people. Advocacy in favor of sterilization was one of Harry Laughlin's first major projects at the ERO. He published his model eugenical sterilization law that proposed to authorize sterilization of the socially inadequate people supported in institutions or maintained wholly or in part by public expense. The law encompassed feeble-minded, insane, criminalistic, epileptic, inebriate, diseased, blind, deaf, deformed, dependent, including orphans, ne'er-do-wells, tramps, homeless, and paupers. The people who were at the bottom rung of American society were people that they decided to sterilize. People who had no advocates, no one speaking on their behalf saying, no, you shouldn't do this. For the most part, they had no one that came to their defense. So the laws dictated they should be sterilized. And sterilized they were. The blue states are the states that had sterilization laws on the books. The first 5 states that adopted these laws are in red. So you see It was a nationwide phenomenon. A nationwide phenomenon. Wisconsin sterilizations. About 1,800 people were sterilized in the state of Wisconsin. Beginning in 1915, the first 76 were conducted at the Northern Wisconsin Center for the Developmentally Disabled, a mental hospital. Sterilizations continued in Wisconsin until 1963. 1915 to 1963 in the state of Wisconsin. The law remained on the books until 1978, when the legislature in Madison finally decided to overturn that law. Groups identified in the law for the state of Wisconsin were these: criminals, insane, feeble-minded, and epileptics. They removed epileptics from the list in 1955. 1907, Wisconsin also made it illegal for these groups of people to marry. So if you were labeled as a criminal, insane, feeble-minded, or an epileptic, it was illegal in the state of Wisconsin before you get married. Imagine that. Carrie Buck, the young woman you heard about in the film you saw, she was sterilized October 19, 1927. She was the first American sterilized under the law that Virginia passed, this model sterilization law. And there's a very famous court case that came out of it that you heard a little bit about earlier. I want you guys to watch this. This is from a movie that was made about her life. This is Carrie Buck, and she had a young child.
Hello, is
And this is what
anybody
happened.
home?
Mama, he's here.
Now see right here, see, this is the choke. See, so it's like if somebody pumps too much, then you can choke them and you let go. Something like that. What makes it fun, all right? But then also got the high heel.
And this baby she had was a result of uncle rape right there.
Now be careful, don't break it.
You pay for this.
Go like this.
Look at all this dust already.
Ah, it's just from the back road. I'm gonna send Carrie out to wipe it down. Elizabeth, look at this. Open car. She's thirsty no water.
He was crying at the top. He was crying. Oh my God. I'm crying. He was crying with the heart.
Now let's all just settle down.
What line of germs she carries. Elizabeth, we gotta get to the doctor. Committed now, please.
She's going when all the arrangements are made. And until then, whenever that happens, this is still her home. She was just trying to help.
She'll be right out.
Are you coming, Carrie? Saying her goodbye, I imagine. She does love that child. She'll be right down. Carrie! Oh. Well, doesn't she look pretty? Don't they both? Come on down, dear. Oh, you changed her again. Oh, she does look fine. Did she do it to yourself again? You remember Miss Frederick, don't you? Yeah, say hello.
Hello.
Hello, Carrie. Your bags are in the car.
I can't leave Vivian.
No, dear.
Why don't I take Vivian?
No.
Well, now, she's such a pretty child. Won't you let me hold her?
Let the nice Miss Fredericks hold her.
There now. My, what a little darling. Come on. Go on outside. We're going to let Miss Evans hold her for just a minute, and you and I are going to go say goodbye to Mr. X. Okay? Okay? Where'd you get that little outfit, Carrie? Now, Mrs. Evans is going to hold her for just a minute. We're going to go out here and say goodbye.
Come on, Carrie.
Come on now, Carrie. Carrie. Now, Carrie. Bye-bye. Carrie.
Just a moment, let me see if he's available. It's Miss Jane Talbot again. I'm sorry, he's with a client at the moment. Yes, I'll tell him. She said you promised to call her last week. You can't say she isn't persistent.
I'm almost finished with that historical brief. It's actually very interesting. Do you need something?
No. Wait. I've been invited to a lecture this weekend to Dr. Harry Laughlin of the Carnegie Institute, speaking about eugenics.
Yes, Uncle Arthur's going.
If you're interested, I have an extra ticket. I thought if maybe you weren't studying, you might like to come along.
I'd love to.
There are 10 to 15 million social inadequates out there. And it's not an exaggeration to say that your new law here is historic. If you'll allow me to project into the future. Enforcing the sexual sterilization of the feeble-minded will change the face of this country, and indeed the world. If all the other states would show the courage and the foresight that you Virginians have, by 1950 we could be sterilizing 200,000 a year. And by the turn of the century, we would have an America that would be free of insanity, feeble-mindedness, epilepsy, poverty, and most of its crime. Think of that, ladies and gentlemen. Think of it. There you are. My pleasure.
What's that, How are you?
Oh, hello, Jack. This is Mr. and Mrs. Barrows. The Barrows Sugar Company's my colleague.
Hi.
Lois Apprentice.
Very nice to meet you. 8 to 10,000 feeble-minded in the state.
Yes, but remember, most of them are roaming free out there. They need to be found and committed first. But what we have in our facilities right now, I'd say we do about 400 this year.
I know you were sued a few years ago for sterilizing some inmates. Will this law help prevent future suits?
I hope so, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Dr. Kent, I was hoping to have a word with you.
Well, I would be honored, sir. Thank you.
I know that this case was designed to keep you out of the courts, but it is the opinion of my colleagues and I that you need to get back into the courts as soon as possible.
I don't understand.
We need to have you sued again.
What?
We need a case that'll test this law right to the Supreme Court of the United States.
What if it doesn't pass?
We think it will. Justice Holmes is with us. And the Jew Brandeis is with Holmes. And Butler is the only Catholic. If the Supreme Court stamps its approval, all the other states can come on board.
How exactly would we proceed?
Very simply. You find a subject who touches on as many provisions of the law as possible. Ideally, someone with no religion or close friends or mentally sound relatives. Then you find a cooperative attorney to object to the sterilization, and then you appeal the case right up the ladder to Washington.
Forgive me. If I'm the one being sued, what if we don't win?
I have the full backing of the Carnegie Institute.
He's quite a speaker, huh?
Yes.
You ever read his book?
No, but I've seen it around Uncle Arthur's office. I just haven't had a chance to.
So what do you read?
These days, nothing but law books.
No D.H. Lawrence? Oh, come on, it's not that scandalous.
No, I don't find it all that scandalous. I have heard
What did you hear?
about it. That it's...
Hey, what's that?
She looks like she's lost.
Well, I run away from the colony. Let me handle it.
I'm going to Charlottesville.
Where are you coming from? Coming from the colony?
Yeah. What makes Carrie's story very, very just one of the most unfair of all of the cases I've read about. This young woman was raped by an uncle. She was placed in this mental institution because she had a child out of wedlock. Yes. Now, she was to be the test case for the Virginia law. They wanted, Harry Laughlin, who you saw giving the lecture, wanted this law to be challenged so that the U.S. Supreme Court could say it's constitutional. He wanted to make sure that it was the top levels of law in the country that would say, okay, this law is okay. So what they did is they had the doctor who was doing the sterilizations at this hospital agree to be sued. They hired an attorney for Carrie to represent her interest into not being sterilized. And this attorney that they hired for her was a person who was very much in favor of sterilizations. He wanted to lose the case on purpose, and he basically didn't put up much of a fight. So it went all the way through the courts to the U.S. Supreme Court, and in 1927, the Supreme Court ruled that it was perfectly okay to sterilize Carrie Buck. Famous case called Buck v. Bell, Supreme Court decision by the famous Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes. It is better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. The principle that sustains compulsory vaccination is broad enough to cover cutting the fallopian tubes. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. That's what the Supreme Court ruled.
Government officials conspiring on a project so horrible it is hard to believe it happened in our country and not that long ago. We have a story here tonight about cruelty in the name of science and about the government in effect trying to play God. But it's also about the strength and resilience of the human spirit and about a remarkable woman named Elaine Riddick. Dr. Nancy Snyderman takes us tonight to North Carolina to investigate a state of shame.
The serene charm of Windfall, North Carolina, a sleepy town where the Perquimans River empties into the Albemarle Sound. But buried in the stillness of this place, it seems time has forgotten a secret shame.
It was sort of a hush-hush type of thing, and records and files were all hidden away down in the basement, locked under a key.
Until this past summer, when the ugly truth about what happened here and in towns all across North Carolina could be hidden no more.
If there's anyone in this room that's too embarrassed to tell your story, don't be. Tell it. It needs to be told, and you need to tell it all.
There were a lot of stories that shocked those in the room that day. Stories of shame, confusion, grief. But one story, one single story seemed to rise above the rest.
I didn't want nobody looking at me because everybody knew what happened to me. That's how I felt inside. My heart bleeds every single day. I'm crushed. They cut me open like I was a hog.
Elaine Riddick's story began in Windfall, among the cotton fields that rose up to meet the tiny 2-bedroom house she shared with her grandmother, affectionately known as Miss Peaches.
When you come back here, is it nostalgic? Is it bittersweet? Does it bring up moments of anger?
All of the above. Sometimes I can come here and I am in, I can look around me and I can find beauty in the ugliness, the ugly things that happened to me.
It was 1967. Elaine's mother was in prison. Her father had abandoned her, and 5 of her siblings were in an orphanage. Every adult she knew had betrayed her, with the exception of one, her grandmother.
She just paid special attention to me. And she loved me. And she just gave me something that I needed. Sorry.
But life was about to get worse for the poor, hungry little girl Miss Peaches tried to protect.
As I was walking home, I took the long road, and the next thing I know, I was drugged and I was attacked.
And you were raped?
And I was raped. And my life was threatened. That if I ever told anyone, that he was going to kill me.
And you were 13?
I was 13.
That brutal rape resulted in a pregnancy. Nearly 9 months to the day of the assault, she went into labor.
Got to the hospital and they put me in a room, and that's all I remember. That's all I remember. When I woke up with bandages on my stomach.
Meaning what?
At that time, I didn't know what it meant.
What she didn't know was that the baby boy she gave birth to that day would be her last.
No one told me. I never even knew.
She had been sterilized, targeted by a state board that ordered that this kind of surgery be performed on thousands of North Carolinians from 1929 all the way to 1974. 7,600 men, women, and children determined by social workers to be feeble-minded or promiscuous were sterilized, usually without their consent, and it was perfectly legal.
Little boys, they would castrate them. Little girls, they would go inside them and take out their organs.
State Representative Larry Womble.
Why would they want to do that to a young girl?
Why did they?
Well, they had several reasons they thought were valid at that time.
Their reasons were based on a scientific theory called eugenics, which became popular in the 1920s. Eugenicists believed that poverty, promiscuity, and alcoholism were inherited traits. It was a simple theory with a radical solution. Sterilize those the state would have to take care of and improve society's gene pool. Some of America's wealthiest citizens of the time were eugenicists. Dr. Clarence Gamble of the Procter & Gamble fortune and James Haynes of the Hosiery Company founded the Human Betterment League, which produced brochures like these, stoking fears of, quote, morons mixing with the general population.
Representative, when you look back, was this a well-intentioned idea with the best science at the time that then just went awry?
I don't know if that was the best intention to weed out negative things in our society. You're playing God over a whole group of people's lives, and I don't think we're supposed to play God like that.
31 states had legal eugenics programs, and by the late 1960s, tens of thousands of Americans had been sterilized. It began as a way to control welfare spending on poor white women and men. But over time, North Carolina shifted focus, targeting more women and more blacks than whites.
It was a monetary, economic thing. Get them off of welfare so the state would not have to pay for their children. That's fine, but you don't do that by doing this kind of thing. Some people have even expressed to me that it borders on genocide.
A third of sterilizations were ordered on girls under the age of 18, some as young as 9 years old.
What in the world will this lady do with my poor child?
I think he sterilized an entire caseload.
The voices of social workers involved with eugenic sterilization. You're hearing them broadcast for the first time, some of them explaining the decision to sterilize in these recordings made in 1997 by Rutgers professor Johanna Schoen.
What chance does another child have in his family? And I think a lot of motivation for workers probably came from that.
Over a period of a year or 2 years, he got all of the women sterilized. I think that was perhaps a little excessive.
In 1968, Americans were rebelling, protesting the Vietnam War, marching for civil rights. And while most states had abandoned their eugenics programs by then, the sterilization of poor Americans was still happening in North Carolina, and no one seemed to notice. So it was for Elaine Riddick that a signature on a dotted line sealed her fate. During the cesarean birth of her only son, her fallopian tubes were cut and tied off.
There is a document in your file that says regarding the sterilization, grandmother consents and the procedure has been explained to Elaine.
Well, how can you take a 13-year-old kid and tell them this is what you're going to do to them? The terminology did not register. How can you explain to a 13-year-old kid that you're going to sterilize them? They took something so dearly from me, something that was God-given.
Trauma like this would cripple most of us, but in a moment when we continue this story after the break, we see her climb back and what she did for her only son. Again, our story continues right after this. Welcome back as we now get back to our story. For decades, North Carolina sterilized people it deemed unfit, and it did so largely in secret. And now victims like Elaine Riddick are demanding answers from the government. Dr. Nancy Snyderman continues with Elaine's fight to rebuild her life and the state of shame that existed back then in North Carolina.
On the 4th floor of a government building in downtown Raleigh, North Carolina, thousands upon thousands of records few have ever seen. These are the Eugenics Files?
Yes, and they're confidential. They're records that are not open to the general public.
State Archivist Dick Langford is the keeper of the files that hold the secrets of one of the most controversial practices of modern history, the mass sterilization of Americans against their will. When you've looked at them, what was your initial response?
I look at them with a heavy heart because I realize these records, as patient records, have impact on people's lives.
When you look at these records, you realize they're from not that long ago, 1950s, 1960s, and they represent all kinds of people. Take this one, for instance, a teenager who was sterilized because she was deemed promiscuous at the age of 8. And here's one, a 16-year-old incest victim. Social workers got consent for her sterilization from the father who raped her. And then there are the records of Elaine Riddick, sterilized after being raped at age 13. Social workers had declared her promiscuous, mentally retarded, unfit to procreate. But Elaine had something to prove.
I ended up going to college. I took the entrance exam. I passed. I got in.
And she graduated with an associate's degree from a technical college in 1982. Is some of this you saying to them by your actions, you guys were so wrong?
Yes, definitely. Definitely. You know, I'm worthy. I'm not that little nappy head, dirty clothes, hungry little girl anymore. I don't know where I would be if I listened to the state of North Carolina.
Her proudest achievement has been her son, born 43 years ago and under unimaginable circumstances.
Hey, Mom. Hi. Good to see you. Good to see you.
Hi, I'm Nancy.
How are you, Nancy? Nice to meet you.
You're Tony.
Thank you. Yes, Tony.
You're a strapping guy.
Thank you.
Today, Tony Riddick is a successful entrepreneur. You must be unbelievably proud of your mother.
Oh, absolutely. I am. This is my buddy, my friend, my mother, everything, my sister. I'm proud of her because she never stopped fighting. You know, she continues to fight, and I think that's very important.
What do you want?
What do I want? Well, what do I want? I would like for the state of North Carolina to right what they wrong with me. At one point, I sued the state of North Carolina for $1 million, and that's been over 30-some years ago.
And what did you expect when you filed that suit for $1 million?
I expected for them to give me $1 million.
She got nothing. She lost her case against the state because a jury decided no laws were broken. She appealed it all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, which declined to hear her argument.
I was embarrassed and I was surprised.
All she and the other 7,600 victims have is an apology, emailed to the Winston-Salem Journal from then Governor Mike Easley in 2002. But after mounting pressure from reporters, the state decided to do more and convened a task force in 2003. Nothing resulted. Then another task force came and went.
We're the United States, for God's sakes. This was so wrong.
Which brings us back to that day last summer when victims and their families had their say in front of another government task force assigned to determine how they should be compensated.
What do you think I'm worth? What do you think I'm worth? It doesn't matter what you think I'm worth, it's what I think I'm worth.
Priceless. Yes, ma'am.
There's nothing that the state of North Carolina can do to justify what they did to me. What they did to these other victims.
They told me to sign papers. I didn't sign no papers. I ain't never signed the papers. That was not my signature on these papers.
North Carolina is the only state to consider compensation in the range of $20,000 to $50,000. But Tony Riddick, standing up for his mother and the other victims, said that's too little, too late.
And my mother's been sitting here suffering for 43 years and nothing has been done. This is sinister.
I'm so afraid that they're going to try to wait till all these people die. And that's a shame. That's a mark. It's an ugly chapter in North Carolina's book. We must step up to the plate and we must realize, take responsibility.
There is nobody in North Carolina who is waiting for anybody to die. Again,
Bev Perdue is North Carolina's governor.
To stand up and say, I want this solved on my watch. I want there to be completion.
Is there a plan to help these people?
Our plan is very thoughtful, I believe. We have gone through the process of having the hearings. You have to have people who self-report. I can't.
Why? I mean, you have the records. Why not proactively go out and find these people?
Because even if you go out and proactively find them, there are lots of people, just like in other medical cases, who don't want their data shared. They want to know money. Nancy, from my perspective as a woman and as the governor of this state, this is not about the money. There isn't enough money in the world to pay these people for what has been done to them.
As the Riddicks await the state's decision, they focus on the part of the family legacy that really matters.
There's something to be said about young men who are raised by strong women.
Yes, ma'am. I got my cup overflowing.
Go!
Every day they appreciate life's simple gifts, finding joy in Tony Jr., who has yet to understand his grandmother's place in a terrible chapter of American history.
He gives me the love. So with that, I can do anything in the world that I want to do. And that can be anybody I want to be.
Well, I got stuck.
I'm sitting here thinking, these aren't records you unearthed in a parchment book with sketchy details from the past. We just heard audio recordings of something saying someone...
July of 2013, the state of North Carolina finally decided to compensate these victims. State lawmakers voted $10 million package to make amends for the impact of eugenics. Between 1929 and 1974, nearly 8,000 people were deemed feeble-minded, otherwise undesirable, and were sterilized. This money was included in the spending plan that was passed, and it set aside money for one-time payments to victims, but the final amount paid to each individual depend on how many come forward. $10 million appropriated for eugenics victims will be distributed equally among them starting in 2015. This is an effort to give more victims the opportunity to come forward and be authenticated. If the victim dies, the portion will move to their estate. So North Carolina finally compensated some of these victims. Let's look at the next part of how eugenics affected our history as a nation. Immigration restrictions. We've all heard this from the Statue of Liberty. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free, so on and so forth. That's what the Statue of Liberty says. That's what it stands for. That's what we've been told. That's what we go to New York and we have to visit the Statue of Liberty. We have to, I mean, it's idyllic. However, America's never really been a melting pot. It's never been a melting pot. 18 million refugees and opportunity-seeking immigrants arrived between 1890 and 1920. German Lutherans, Irish Catholics, Russian Jews, Slavic Orthodox, one huddled mass surged in after another. They did not mix or melt. For the most part, they remained insoluble. Instead, a network of state and local Jim Crow laws enforced apartheid between blacks and whites in much of the nation, especially in the South. Millions of Native Americans were being forced onto reservations as well. Eugenicists viewed crime as a major issue, and they wanted to prevent crime from recurring. They looked at crime as something that was passed down from generation to generation. They believed very strongly that people were born criminals, and they considered certain Europeans to be of the criminal type. So as a result, they looked at immigrants differently. They considered immigration to be race suicide. Race suicide. Allowing certain people in from Europe was race suicide. Speaking of Southeastern European immigrants, eminent sociologist E.A. Ross says such groups lack the ancestral foundations of American character, and even if they catch step with us, they and their children will nevertheless impede our progress. 1911 book, Hereditary in Relation to Eugenics. Mr. Davenport from the ERR insisted that if immigration from Southeastern Europe continued, America would rapidly become darker in pigmentation, smaller in stature, more mercurial, more attached to music and art, more given to crimes of larceny, kidnapping, assault, murder, rape, and sexual immorality. He also said, immigrants are desirable who are of good blood, undesirable who are of bad blood. Once again, remember the concept of race at that time was not the concept of race we have nowadays. Not every European was considered to be a good European. Not all of them were welcomed with open arms at the Statue of Liberty. Mr. Kellogg, the famous Kellogg fortune, the Kellogg cereal fortune, organized the first race betterment conference in Battle Creek, Michigan. And their purpose was to lay the foundations for the creation of a super race in America. We have wonderful new races of horses, cows, and pigs, he said. Why should we not have a new and improved race of men? He wanted the white races of Europe to establish a race of human thoroughbreds. Human thoroughbreds. This was their plan. They wanted to purify the breeding stock of the race at all costs.
May I have your attention, please? Public library is closing promptly at 8 o'clock. If you have any materials to check out, please do so now. Internet terminals will shut down at 7:55. Thank you.
Their three-pronged program was based on sterilization, mass incarceration, and sweeping immigration restrictions. The compulsory sterilization of certain degenerates, affirmed Laughlin, is therefore designed as a eugenical agency complementary to the segregation of the socially unfit classes and to the control of the immigration of those who carry defective germplasm. We've always had immigration restrictions in America. 1790, the Naturalization Act, defined citizenship requirements as very simply being a white person. If you weren't white, you could not become a citizen of the United States of America. And that stayed on the books until the 1950s. 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed, preventing any more Chinese from coming into the country. Literally hundreds of thousands of them had traveled to help build the West, and they were stopped in their tracks. 1907, a gentleman's agreement was signed with the Japanese government where they promised to not send any more Japanese immigrants to the United States. 1917, Asiatic Barred Zone law was passed where they took a big pen, drew a big circle around Asia, and prevented anybody from inside of that circle from immigrating into the United States. That included Koreans, Chinese, people from the subcontinent of India as well. Immigration Act of 1924 put a quota system in place, and it was the most restrictive law ever passed. Harry Laughlin helped push this law through, and what they did, they put together a quota system that said the percentage of people coming into the country will be based on their percentages in the country today. So the 1920 census was the most recent data, and they looked at that and they were going to put the quota system in place. So basically they would say that 3% of the people allowed into the country would be based on their percentages in the country today. So this is what they did. They wanted to prevent people from Southern and Eastern Europe from coming in, but there have been millions of them coming in over the past 20, 30 years. So what they said is, we're going to change it a little bit. We're going to go back to the 1880 census and use their percentages then. And they knew that the percentages of Southern and Eastern Europeans was much lower. So they set the quota based on those numbers from the 1880 census instead of the most recent census, the 1920 census. There are also marital restrictions. Anti-miscegenation laws. Virginia's Racial Integrity Act prevented people of different races from marrying. Over 32 states have restrictions on marriage across race. Famous Supreme Court case, Loving versus Virginia. We had a presentation on that recently here at the museum back in the early part of the winter. Fascinating case. This black woman and this white man were married against the law. They went to Washington, D.C. because they knew they couldn't get legally married in Virginia. They came back to Virginia. The state found out that they were living in sin because it was illegal for them to live together as husband and wife. They broke into their house at 3 o'clock in the morning, asked the woman, "Who is that man lying next to you?" "It's my husband," of course. They were both arrested. They were given the option of leaving the state or going to prison. They decided to leave the state. They decided later to come back and live in the state without anybody knowing, and they challenged the case. It went all the way to U.S. Supreme Court, and in 1967, U.S. Supreme Court made those marriage restriction laws, those anti-miscegenation laws, illegal. So until 1967, it was against the law in many states, not Wisconsin. They never passed on those laws, but it was against the law to marry across race. That's the end of my presentation. I want you guys to leave with this thought. I've covered a lot of information. There's so much more about eugenics that I could have shared with you. I could have easily done 10 different programs just on eugenics. But I wanted to give you guys an idea of how this concept that we call race has kind of worked its magic in America over the years in such an ugly way. And I think the reason that it's really important to understand these things is because when we think of race, nowadays, we have a very clear image of what race is, and that image hasn't always been the same. It's changed over the course of time. And so when we talk about racism today and how certain races of people in this country are treated very badly and end up getting the short stick, when you look back in American history, there have been other groups of people who were called certain races who got the short end of the stick that we never heard about. We never heard the stories of the Europeans who were given the short end of the stick because they were considered to be not the right class of white people. They suffered. They were not allowed into the United States. And it amazes me, when I learn about these things, it amazes me how often we as a nation, if we look back honestly in our history, how often we've just indiscriminately chosen people by whatever particular characteristic we choose. We've chosen the characteristic that they have in common, and we've said, based on this characteristic, we're going to treat you like this. And in many cases, these people are treated horribly and never compensated for this horrible treatment. And so that's a part of America. That's a part of who we are as a people. It's a part of the fabric of our nation. It's a part of our nation we don't like to talk about. It's a part of our nation's history that we don't learn about in school because people don't want us to know these things. Remember at the beginning, the blue pill and the red pill? We're living in a world where we've been tricked into believing that what we see and what we hear is real. A lot of what we've learned, a lot of what we believe about race and racism is absolutely positively lies. We need to become better informed individuals. We need to learn more. Everybody needs to hear these stories. Everybody should know who Carrie Buck is. Everybody should hear the stories of these individuals in North Carolina who were sterilized. Everybody who's in America should know that between 60 and 65,000 Americans were sterilized against their will. Simply because someone, a doctor, a social worker, someone wrote on a piece of paper that they were unfit and they should not be allowed to have children anymore. You guys heard about the young girl, 8 years old, 9 years old. How can you choose to take a child that young and say they're promiscuous and sterilize them? But that's what America does. They do it because of complicity of the rest of us, because we don't pay attention. I hate to quote this man, but he said something brilliant at one time. Adolf Hitler said this about the German people. He says, it is good for us, speaking of the government of Germany, it is good for us that the people don't pay attention. We as Americans don't pay attention either. We need to begin to pay attention to prevent these things from happening in the future. We need to share these stories. We need to pass on this information to friends, family members, co-workers, enemies, whomever. We need to know these things in order to move forward. In order to have racial reconciliation, we need to know more stuff. So please stay informed, Jessica will have the information out about when I come back. I'm hoping to do it in May, because I'm going to be very, very busy over the next couple months. But I'm hoping to come back in May and continue this series on race. And I hope to see all of you back again. I think the information will be what I call mind-opening. Mind-opening, okay? So I want to thank you all once again for coming out in this brutal weather. It's amazing to me that you guys were willing to come out. And I truly, absolutely, truly am amazed and so appreciative to see you guys come out for this presentation. So thank you very much.